Imagine a billionaire who's used to controlling everything: markets, people, entire cities. His world is built on numbers, contracts, and absolute order. But one day he faces something money can't control: his own son, partially paralyzed and cut off from life. In a quiet, expensive restaurant, where even the waiters move silently, the boy suddenly reaches out, not to his father, but to a waitress, and says two simple words: "Dance with me?" In that moment, the billionaire realizes one thing: he is no longer the one in control. Watch this story to the end. It may remind you that sometimes the most important step isn't forward. It's the one where you step aside and give someone else space. A waitress dances with his disabled son. A billionaire experiences for the first time the meaning of happiness. What if? A billionaire, accustomed to ruling the world through numbers and power, suddenly encounters something he has no control over: his own son, partially paralyzed and cut off from life. Before we begin our story, write in the comments from which part of the world you are watching today. Richard Montgomery hated applause, especially that which came too early. His familiar world was quiet, clear, and predictable, like the numbers in a bank account. That's why he chose LeMay's restaurant, where the waiters move silently and the table smoother than the surfaces in his offices. Tonight, for the first time in 2 years, he was not alone. To his right sat Lucas, his 10-year-old son, whose skin was too pale and whose movements were unsteady. Ever since the doctors had pronounced the phrase partial paralysis, the child's life had become narrow. Clinics, nurses, physical therapy, dancing, music, laughter. It all seemed like another world, one he could no longer enter. But that very evening, something happened, something no one expected. The live piano began to play the awakening of spring, and at that very moment, Lucas, barely able to stand, stretched across the table. "Let's dance," he said. "Not for your father, for the waitress, Diana." A pause fell in the room. The sound of someone dropping a cutlery was heard. The restaurant manager was already rising from his seat, but Diana only lingered for a second. Then, silently, she removed her furtuk, walked around the table, and took the boy's hand. The music continued. 3 steps. Cautious, hesitant, each one as if walking on ice. The people in the room stopped eating. Someone turned on their phone camera. Someone turned away, embarrassed. But Richard couldn't take his eyes off him. His son, who hadn't stood up without help for 2 years, moved slowly, clumsily, but independently. He didn't understand how this was possible. He understood only one thing now: he wasn't driving. Later, when the boy fell asleep in the car, Richard replayed this episode in his mind over and over again. Not because of his son's gesture, but because of the woman. Who was she? Why wasn't she afraid of the cameras, or the stairs, or even of him? The name on the check: Diane Johnson. He memorized it and decided that tomorrow that name would be worth much more than a tip. The next morning, Richard woke up earlier than usual. He wasn't irritated, wasn't thinking about meetings, wasn't looking through reports. He was watching a video that had leaked online. A little boy was dancing with a waitress to live music and a commentary underneath. Perhaps this dance was his first step, or for someone else, his last chance to change everything. By the afternoon, he already knew where Diana worked, where she lived, and what courses she had completed. All within an hour. He sent a courier with a business card. She came to the Montgomery's tower the next day without a folder, without a notebook, without fear. "I want to offer you a job," he said when they were alone. "I guessed it," she replied calmly. "Not as a waitress. You could be a companion." "An emotional crutch," she interrupted. He fell silent. She looked him straight in the eyes. "I don't sell emotional support. I create an environment in which a child can grow." And before he could ask a single question, she stood up. "You're looking for control, but your son needs freedom. If you ever want to see what that looks like, come to my center for an open lesson." "Center?" "Yes. Freedom Steps. Dance therapy. Your team has refused funding 3 times. Formal status," they said. She left without saying goodbye, and he suddenly felt not irritation, but interest. The next day, he arrived at her center unannounced, without security. The first thing he heard was laughter. The second, music. The third, the voice of Professor Mercer, whose name he knew from Harvard. And the fourth was a step, one independent step. Lucas's, unnoticed by the camera or the press, only by Diana and his father. When uncertainty arose in Richard Montgomery's life, he followed a pattern: analysis, influence, control. But this time, everything was different. He stood in the corner of a small room with a wooden floor, modest mirrors, and worn-out speakers. And his son danced not like a champion, but like a free man. By himself, Dr. Mercer said, watching. The first independent step. A micro-effort. In the thigh muscle. You don't understand how much is behind this. Richard nodded, but he understood it was much more complicated than neuroplasticity. His son didn't take this step on a treadmill under the supervision of a physical therapist. He took it here, among children laughing with every fall, unafraid to appear clumsy. And at the center of this world stood her, Diana Johnson. After the lesson, he approached her, not as a patron, but as someone who had witnessed a miracle and wanted an explanation. Why didn't you tell me who you were right away? And you should have listened. He remained silent. She continued. When you look at people, you see titles, portfolios, statistics. In the restaurant, you saw a waitress, but I saw a child who wanted to take a step. Everything else is unimportant. You manipulated, you exploited this moment in public. Stop, she interrupted, without raising her voice. I didn't use your son. I accepted his step. It's not the same thing. He felt his jaw tighten. Inside, he seethed with a sense of loss of control. And if he fell, he would fall many times. But it would be his fall, not yours. Later, in his office, he opened the dossier that the analysts had prepared. Everything he had learned about Diana over the previous 24 hours turned out to be a tiny fraction of her true biography. Diana Johnson, 33, a graduate of New York University, Department of Child Development, co-author of the Freedom Steps program. She worked at a children's rehabilitation center before it closed due to lack of funding. She applied to the Montgomery Foundation 3 times and was rejected 3 times. Reasons: insufficient legal protection, lack of partners, insufficient organizational maturity. But now her name was being discussed in the press. After dancing in the restaurant with his son, he still wanted to accuse her of a calculated game, of calculation, of subtly using emotions to advance her own program. But every time he returned to that moment, he saw only a hand extended to the boy, not to the audience. 3 days later, he came to her center again. This time alone, without his son, without security. You said you were creating conditions. How? She didn't answer right away, only brought out a chair and pointed to the audience. Look, a girl with an amputated leg and a boy with a prosthetic arm entered the room. They were laughing. Diana turned on music, simple, rhythmic, and began a slow, almost invisible dance with them, without explaining, without commanding, simply moving and letting them repeat. Slowly at first, then more confidently. We don't train muscles, she said finally. We teach the body to trust itself through movement, through contact, through play. He didn't know how to answer. There was nothing of his world in this: schemes, algorithms, diagrams. Only a soft, unnoticeable force pushing toward freedom. When he returned home, Lucas was waiting for him, smiling. Dad, can we go there again tomorrow? He asked. Richard nodded, but then asked, why did you choose her in the restaurant? Lucas thought, because she wasn't afraid of me, or that I might fall. Late at night, he reopened Diana's file and finally saw not numbers, but a person. She wasn't looking for funding. She was looking for the right to work and didn't need a savior. Her work was already saving. He understood that her strength wasn't in her methods, but in her decision not to retreat when systems failed, in her ability to listen to those who were unheard, in her courage to take a child's hand, not knowing who was sitting at the next desk. The next day, he invited the foundation's board to his office. We were wrong, he said. We had a working program before our eyes. We refused. Now I propose we change that. Full funding, one of the lawyers clarified. For 5 years, Richard confirmed, with one condition: no interference in either the methods or the management. Complete freedom for Diane and Dr. Mercer. This is unprecedented. This is necessary, he interrupted. On the 42nd floor of the Montgomery Tower, silence reigned behind the mirrored glass walls. Not a single detail was random. Minimalism, chrome, glass. Everything spoke of power, of control, of inaccessibility. Diana sat calmly, straight-backed, across from Richard. She wore the same simple gray blouse. As in the center, she seemed to want nothing, and this was precisely what was throwing Richard off his usual rhythm. Your project will be fully funded, he said. We are prepared to invest significant resources in expansion, new premises, hiring specialists. Everything is under your management. Why now? She asked. I saw my son take a step without assistance. This is an argument that is difficult to ignore. This is an argument you have never noticed before, she replied. He pressed his lips. I admit my mistake, he said after a pause. You want trust? Under these conditions, complete freedom for 5 years. With you as a curator, with Dr. Mercer as a scientific supervisor. Diana didn't smile. It's not about trust, she said. It's about understanding boundaries. I won't become your employee, I won't appear in reports. I don't sell success. And I certainly don't sell children for a pretty presentation. Richard looked at her for a long time. He was used to people thanking him for such offers. Diana, no? Then how? Do you see it? She didn't answer right away. She went to the window and looked out at the city. Below are millions of lives, each in their own struggle. I see a space without hierarchy, without dictates, where everyone can be themselves, even if it means a fall, even if it means chaos. You want the foundation to invest in chaos. I want your foundation to invest in freedom. He left the office in complete silence. He was met by advisors, assistants, lawyers. Everyone had questions, schedules, documents. But he didn't hear anyone. Somewhere in the depths of his mind, the words of his late wife surfaced. Dance isn't about steps, it's about contact. While you're in control, you don't dance, you command. And he understood. Diana isn't challenging. She simply doesn't agree to the rules everyone else plays by. Through a week later, they signed the agreement without a press release or fanfare. The Montgomery Foundation invested in the expansion of the Freedom Steps Center, the construction of a new building, and a training program for specialists in research supervised by Dr. Mercer. Diana did not agree to be the face of the project. She declined any role related to the foundation's management. I'm staying in the audience. This is my place, she said. When construction began, Richard arrived at the site without a suit or a driver. Lucas was already there, helping set up flash drives with other children. One of them, a boy in a wheelchair, asked, Are you sure you're the son of that Montgomery? Yeah, Lucas nodded. But today he's just my dad. Richard heard this and felt something shift within him, quiet, almost unnoticeable, but very important. That same evening, he asked Dr. Mercer for his first collection of literature on neuroplasticity and began reading, not to understand how to control this process, but to understand how not to interfere. The open lessons at the Freedom Steps Center were not publicly announced. There were no banners, no social media posts, no journalists. Only parents, children, and volunteers. And the music wasn't background, but pulsating, like the breath of a living organism. Richard entered the room unannounced. He was increasingly appearing like this, unexpectedly, without security, without a suit. Less and less with a notepad, more and more often with attention. The room was full. A boy with a prosthetic leg was teaching a girl in a wheelchair the basics of spinning. 3 teenagers were arguing over the best way to improvise a song without a beat. A small child, barely able to walk, tried to catch the ball, but his gaze was fixed on Lucas, the boy, who 6 months ago couldn't stand for more than a minute without support, was now slowly rising from a deep, slumped position, without support or command. Diana stood nearby, but didn't intervene. She merely nodded, like a conductor who senses when to step in. Lucas took a step, and a second, light but confident. The audience didn't applaud or gasp. Everything continued, as usual, because that was the norm here. Only Richard froze, as if, for the first time, he saw his son not as a project, but as a being with his own will. Later, He approached Diana, not with a proposal, not with a report, but with a question. How did you know he was ready? I didn't understand, she replied. I simply stopped interfering. He nodded silently. It was painful to admit that sometimes love takes the form of control, and only by letting go can you see who stands before you. A week before the first phase of construction of the new building, a lawyer from the fund approached Diana, the standard procedure for negotiating the contract. He was polite, precise with the tables and terms. She reread the first clause and quietly smiled. And where is the clause about independence? Of the methodology? Check it out. Complete freedom. No correcting, no editing, no approval of every step. That was the original condition. The lawyer hesitated. Forgive me, but for an investment of this scale, she closed the folder and returned it to him. So, there will be no investment. 2 hours later, Richard entered the room. This is a mistake. The extra paperwork will be corrected. This is not a mistake. It's a system. Everything in it must be under control, even what is not understood. I'm trying to understand. No, he said slightly. I see, but this isn't enough. We need to learn to retreat. More than once. Systematically. He looked into the room where the children continued to move, fall, and laugh. Nothing was going according to plan. Everything was working. A week later, Richard personally signed the final version of the agreement. 1 page, 1 signature, 1 clause. Complete methodological and organizational independence for the Freedom Steps project. No right of interference from the investor. During the morning class, Lucas approached the new girl. She didn't speak, only gestured that she was afraid to get up. He knelt down next to her and extended his hand without words, without pressure. Diana looked at them and nodded. Now he truly leads. The next day, a request came to the foundation's office from a large media company. They wanted to make a documentary about the transformation of Montgomery and Freedom Steps. The foundation's press service prepared a press release, a script, a list of topics, and comments. Richard took it all, leafed through it, and said, "Throw it all away. Let them film what they see. If we're trying to control history, we're no longer in it." That evening, he was back in the audience, but this time on the sidelines, without questions, without instructions. He watched the children move, how they made mistakes, how they found their rhythm. He didn't understand the entire methodology, didn't know the terms, but he felt it. There was more life here than in all his annual reports. And this was a turning point, a quiet, inconspicuous one. The cameras didn't catch it, but it was at that moment that the billionaire ceased to be a conductor and became an observer. Everyone came to the opening of the new building of the Freedom Steps Center. Parents, children, volunteers, teachers, even those who had once doubted the project stood by the stage today, not because they had been invited, but because it was no longer possible to ignore what was happening there. Against the backdrop of the sleek architecture, light, glass, and wide halls without thresholds or stairs. Particularly noticeable was the hall without a stage, just a circle, a simple wood in the floor, the mirrors, and the music pouring from somewhere above. It was here, among hundreds of people, that Lucas did something that truly changed not only his father, but everyone watching. He approached the little girl wearing the exoskeleton. She was crying, not from pain, but from fear. The first step seemed impossible to her. Lucas knelt down next to her and, like Diana once did with him, simply extended his hand, without words, without promises, simply his hand. She looked at her for a long moment, then took one step. He took a second step next to her, she a third, and so on, until they were in the center of the circle. The music continued. No one applauded. Everyone simply watched the birth of a movement without a conductor. And at that moment, Richard, the father, the billionaire, the man whose power had once been measured by graphs, stood against the wall and did nothing. He knew this wasn't his stage. He shouldn't be in the center. His place was nearby, not in front, not behind, but right next to them. Later at a brief press conference, when one of the reporters, with a haughty smile, asked, "Mr. Montgomery, you're currently investing in something that doesn't generate direct profit. Don't you think this is more of an image project than a contribution to the real economy?" Richard looked at Lucas, sitting in a circle with the other children, and said, "Real leaders don't show the way. They know when to follow those who show a better direction." The journalist fell silent. The next day, Diana received a handwritten letter and signed, "Unspoken. You were right. Sometimes the first step isn't forward. It's a step back to make room for another. Thank you for not backing down." She folded the letter and put it in a drawer. It already contained dozens of drawings, notes, photographs of children she had once held by the hand. Not to lead, to be there when they choose their own path. 3 months later, the center was fully operational. Dr. Mercer received approval for a grant to study the effects of dance therapy. Lucas removed his second brace ahead of schedule. Richard began giving private lectures to leading businessmen. The topic was how not to interfere with those who know what they're doing. And neither of them no longer needed each other. They became neither assistants nor sponsors, but part of a single movement. At the center's half-year celebration, Diane remained backstage. She didn't, like stages, didn't believe in awards. She simply watched. Lucas wasn't alone. Dozens of children were around. And when the same melody that had been playing in the restaurant began to play, he made a move. That took everyone's breath away. For the first time, he led not like a child who needed to be protected, but like a man who could sense the rhythm of others, including those who were afraid, those who were shy, those who thought they couldn't. Richard didn't take center stage. He remained in the shadows. And it was the loudest statement of his life. He no longer led. He followed. The true transformation in this story happens not in the stands or in the headlines, but in the silence of the room, where for the first time, a grown man consciously stands aside, not because he was removed, but because he chose to let go. Richard Montgomery, accustomed to subordination, numbers, and control, finally understood not every step needs to be controlled. Some just need to be allowed. Lucas didn't just learn to walk. He learned to lead, to be a part, to support others. And Diana, initially perceived as a random figure, became the one who created the conditions that revealed not only the child's strength, but also the father's vulnerability. In their interaction, there were no winners or losers, only growth, trust, and movement. Thus ends the story, not of a miracle, but of a choice, when those in power learn not to dictate the path, but to follow those who sense it best. When dance becomes a metaphor, not a liberation from limitations, but an escape from the illusion of control. And in this, perhaps, lies true victory. The true transformation in this story didn't happen on a stage or in the headlines. It happened in a quiet room where a grown man chose, for the first time, to step aside. Not because someone pushed him out, but because he finally understood it was the right thing to do. Richard Montgomery, a man who measured power through numbers and control, finally realized not every step needs to be controlled. Some steps must simply be allowed. Lucas didn't just learn to walk. He learned to lead, to reach out to those who were afraid, and to support others without being the center of attention. And Diana, the waitress he once dismissed, became the person who created a space where both the child's strength and the father's vulnerability could finally emerge. This story has no winners and losers. It's a story about choosing not to dictate the path, but sometimes following those who feel it better. And maybe that's the real victory, when a dance stops being a sequence of steps and becomes a way out of the illusion of control. Tell me in the comments, are you more about control or about trust? And who did you connect with most, the father, the child, or Diana?